All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are looking at the Falcons linebackers and how they could be the glue that holds this improving defense together, whether or not we will see the team start their veterans or go with a youth movement. And of course, we'll be talking all about the fate of Deion Jones and his future, whether it's in Atlanta or elsewhere this year.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans. And, of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here as part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And like all Locked On Sports Atlanta podcasts, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, whether you're listening to us on Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and you can also watch the podcast on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Give us a like, hit that bell, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So we are continuing our positional breakdowns for the Falcons heading into training camp. And today we're talking about the linebackers. We're halfway through the defense, and we're talking about kind of the glue guys, right? And we'll ask the one big question that we need to pay attention at this position group for the season, one big question for the summer that's going to focus on what happens with Deion Jones. And then we'll talk about, Nate Landman or one of these other guys competing for the practice squad spot. But the big question of the season is going to be who will actually start for the Falcons this year at linebacker, and will that sort of contribute to this defense making waves and improving this upcoming season. Now, I know me personally, I don't talk that much about the linebackers when we talk about this defense over this offseason. And part of that is due to my biases kind of against the position. I tend to believe, philosophically that defenses are made, in terms of what they do on the front or what they do on the back end. And the linebackers are kind of stuck in the middle, sort of being also rans. But linebacker can often be sort of a glue position, the position that kind of holds things together, kind of like safety. You can make a pretty easy case that, it's hard to find a good defense that has bad linebacker play. And while defensive success is rarely driven by linebackers or safeties for that matter, we tend to much like we consider having a good pass rush or lockdown cornerbacks to be the things that good defenses are built around. You kind of need those linebackers to do their thing in order for all this stuff to work. And what's unique about the Falcons linebacker position heading into training camp is this is one of the few positions across their entire roster, and especially on the defensive side of the ball, where we may have some legit competitions for starting spots. Most of the competitions throughout the various position groups are people fighting for, depth roles and whatnot. But when it comes to those competitions for the starting spots, I do expect Nick Kwikkowski and Rashawn Evans, the two veterans the Falcons added this offseason, to ultimately win those competitions. Essentially, as I see it, it is their jobs to potentially lose. And let's talk about Nick Kwikkowski for a second. Spent several years as a backup to Chicago, then due to an injury to Danny Trevathan midway through 2019, finished that season as a starter next to Roquan Smith. By all accounts, played really well. Then was, played well enough to earn a lucrative multi-year contract from the Raiders in 2020, wore the green dot for the Raiders, and that's notable that the Falcons also are bringing in Nick Kwikkowski, presumably to wear the green dot this upcoming season, given that Rashawn Evans, the other presumptive starter for the Falcons, did not wear the green dot, meaning that he called the defense for the Titans in those years. Obviously, Foye Oluokun was the player that wore the green dot for the Falcons last year, and Deion Jones was that player in previous years. And Kwikkowski with the Raiders in his first year there reasonably played well. By all accounts, it was graded well by Pro Football Focus, and a lot of people that I read and talked to said that he played solid. despite the fact that that 2020 Raiders defense was one of the worst defenses in the NFL. And, that's not necessarily a reflection on Nick Witkowski, nor would the Falcons defense being a poor last year be necessarily due to the fact that Foye Oluokun was a bad player. Oluokun played well despite playing on a bad defense. But that poor performance led to the firing of their defensive coordinator. He was replaced by Gus Bradley. And essentially, as I understand it, Kwiatkowski lost his starting job last year with the Raiders, primarily because Gus Bradley wanted to bring in his own guys, Denzel Perriman, KJ Wright, to be their starting linebackers. Now, Kwiatkowski ultimately kind of boils down to a sort of solid role player, do your job type of player, guy that can impact on rundowns as a pass rusher, call the defense, all those various things, and also give you some contributions in coverage. He's not necessarily known as an elite coverage player, but certainly a guy that, particularly playing with the Raiders, playing in a lot of that zone defense, was effective, functional, capable in that role, and should be here in Atlanta. The book on Rashawn Evans, who I'm expecting to play next to him, is Rashawn Evans is a fast and physical, as they say, basically a psychopath when it comes to playing downhill. And that style of play, playing 130 miles per hour with his head on fire, that can lead to creating some big plays, but it also can lead to giving up some big plays. And that inconsistency coupled with some of his limitations in coverage, I think led to him losing steam in Tennessee. And ultimately he lost his starting job last season, after being a former first-round pick back in 2018 when Dean Pease was the D coordinator there. But Evans lost his starting job last year because he got hurt midway through the season. The Titans picked up Zach Cunningham from the Texans, and Cunningham stepped in, and the Titans defense seemingly improved, and it was basically Cunningham keeping his job. Evans did come back late in the year, get some part-time play, but ultimately ended the season as a healthy scratch in the Titans post-season run. And the hope for him is that he's going to be rejoining Dean Pease, and that's going to be the spark to reignite his career, where he played his best football in Tennessee early in his career under Dean Pease when he was the D coordinator there in 2018 and 2019. And both of these guys, Evans and Kwiatkowski, are just like so many other players the Falcons added this offseason as last offseason, which is signing these one-year prove-it deals, come to Atlanta, land on your feet, play well, and someone's going to pay you. And unlike previous off seasons, next off season, that may be the Falcons. And of course, Kwiatkowski, Evans, Eddie Goldman, Lorenzo Carter, Anthony Ferkser, Marcus Mariota all sort of fit this paradigm, and we'll see how those guys perform. But just because I'm expecting those guys to be the starters does not necessarily mean that there won't be significant roles for Troy Andersen and Mykal Walker this year. Right. We know that injuries do happen at this position, and needing to have depth at that linebacker position makes sense. And Kwiatkowski has dealt with injuries in recent years. Evans has dealt with injuries in recent years. So we know that could be also an issue. The other factor that Andersen and Walker bring to the table is the fact that they're very good in coverage. Arguably their biggest strength to their games is their coverage abilities. And those are arguably the biggest weaknesses of Kwiatkowski's and Evans' abilities. So we may see a similar dynamic like we saw last year, where Andersen and or Walker are coming in nickel situations, in passing situations, to lend their coverage ability. And instead you're seeing, someone like an Evans lining up and being asked to be more of a pass rusher in those third down situations rather than dropping into coverage. And we may see Dean Pease cooking up, those creepers and Sims that you heard me referring to on a previous episode that maybe be linked in the card above, that you can hear me talk about that. But where, there's bringing those 4-man pressures. Evans is one of those 4 guys, and they drop Lorenzo Carter, and Evans is joining guys like Eddie Goldman and Grady Jarrett and Arnold Ebiketie as the guys, bringing heat on the quarterback. And we may see that 4-man combination quite a bit this season. But when it comes to Mykal Walker, certainly I think there's a chance that he could beat out Nick Kwiatkowski. I know Walker has been a player that I've kind of generally underrated throughout his career here in Atlanta, and not necessarily been super high on him, being lukewarm on him. And every single year he seems to exceed my expectations. So we'll see if he can do that again this summer and unseat Nick Kwiatkowski for that starting weak side linebacker spot, which I'm presuming that they will be competing over. And then you look at Troy Andersen. We all kind of expect Troy Andersen to sort of be the backup behind Rashawn Evans at that middle linebacker spot. And we thought, Troy Andersen, coming from Montana State, converted linebacker from running back, quarterback early in his career, more of a project type of player. And given his limited experience, given his limitations against the run, the Falcons aren't going to rush him out to the field. But, the various reports coming out of minicamp seem to suggest that maybe Troy Andersen's a little bit ahead of schedule. So maybe that's going to be a real competition between him and Rashawn Evans, or him and one of these other players to get on the field sooner versus later. My expectation is the Falcons will kind of just let, Andersen and Walker maybe marinate for another year behind Kwitkowski and Evans. Next year, Andersen will probably be the one tasked to wear the green dot and call the defense, and the Falcons will kind of give him this initial year to learn and grow the defense. But we'll just sort of have to see if he can accelerate those plans, right? That's the plan, at least as far as I see it. But we all know that, good plans don't always come to fruition. So I think ultimately we're going to see Dean Pease kind of chop these guys up, throw them in the pot, and see what he can cook up. Because I expect we will see all four of these guys on the field at various point. It's just going to be a matter of the competition will kind of bear out how often we see this guy versus that guy, etc. But I think the combination of all four of these players, all of these guys are kind of role players. So, don't expect the world from them. But I think the combination, if you can maximize each one of these guys in their role, the combination of them could be a solid group of linebackers. You have Walker and Andersen contributing off the bench in coverage. You have Evans being that sort of downhill blitzer that can impact on Sims and Creekers. You have Nick Kwikkowski being the general of the defense, calling the defense, as the general was a nickname that some of his Raiders teammates referred to him back in 2020. So he can be that type of guy. And none of those individual components are great by themselves, but collectively they can be sort of the thing that Dean Pease wants out of this linebacker core. And, following that Patriots mantra that we constantly talk about, that do your job mentality, we could see more of these guys just simply just do your job and the collective whole of this group. And that's sort of the general philosophy for the entire defense. Outside of AJ Terrell, outside of Grady Jarrett, there aren't that many true playmakers on this defense. Maybe you could throw Casey Hayward into that mix as well, but everybody else is just kind of role players. But if you all just do your job, Dean Pease is going to be like, I can get this team and this defense to be competent, right? It's not going to be a good defense this season, right? Maybe in the future when they add a couple more difference makers and playmakers, Will Anderson, Jalen Carter. Yes, if you're wondering, am I going to bring that up on every single positional review? Probably. I'll see how I can sort of wiggle it in to when we get to the defensive backs later this week. But yes, get a couple of defensive superstars in addition to these role players, and in the future. But this year you have a bunch of role players working together, doing their job, and they can be a competitive, scrappy defense, right? And they can be that bend but don't break defense that we saw flashes of last year, right? That this team didn't give up big plays. They weren't terrible in the red zone. They can certainly get better in the red zone. And they were generally decent at creating turnovers. And those are other areas that they can continue to get better and be that bend but don't break defense. So when people sit here and tell me like, oh, like Arthur Smith has his guys and now his offense is going to work, if you've been listening to this podcast for the last several weeks and months, yeah, I'm skeptical of that. And yes, you're probably also wondering, is he going to throw Arthur Smith under the bus in every single episode of the podcast? Yeah, I'm working on it, guys. I'm working on it. I'm trying to just, navigate this thing and throw that reference in to every single episode. But when it comes to talking about Dean Pease and talking about having his guys, and now his defense is going to start to work and be a decent, competent defense, not a top 15 unit, but maybe the 22nd best defense that can keep us competitive in like 75% of our games this year. Like, I think we might have some of the pieces, if not most of the pieces, for that to work. And so it's not because the Falcons have now linebackers that are 6'2" versus 6'1", which is what you've heard some rhetoric out there this offseason, but it's just simply these guys have their roles and know what they can do, and if we can see them maximize it this season, we should see an improved defense. So speaking of 6'1" linebackers that quote unquote don't fit the Dean Pease defense, that may not necessarily have a role, the big question of the summer is going to be, what is Deion Jones's future here in Atlanta? And I don't think it's going to be here in Atlanta, and I'll explain why, but we'll talk about sort of where he fits in the potential competitions this summer, should he I be wrong in that assessment. So we'll talk about that as we continue today's Locked On episode. But there have been times throughout all of our lives where we've been in a pinch money wise. I know me, given that I have a pretty old car and the maintenance fees go up year after year, you can be worrying about some situations when money gets a little tight and you're like, look, if something happens with this car, if I have to take it into the shop, it's going to be a problem. I'm not going to necessarily be able to afford that. And now, Dave can get you out of those stressful situations. And Dave is not a person banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. There's no interest, there's no credit check needed. Millions have downloaded Dave, and you can head to the App Store, download the Dave app right now. That's DAVE, and sign up for an extra cash account. $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve. See, your future you will thank you. So, guys, I want to thank Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube and give us a like and hit that bell. Always have recommendations for what your second listen. And starting next week, when you make that second listen, why not check out the Locked On NFL top 50 list, the 50 most in the NFL based off of odds makers at BetOnline. That will begin on July 18th. So available on Locked On NFL July 18th. You will get a breakdown of the top 50 players available. So go check it out on your preferred podcast platform or on YouTube. So we'd already talked about the season and sort of what, the four guys will do this season. And we're not talking about Deion Jones, right? And that's the big question of the summer, right? And we've talked about this a number now today. Basically, I'm just going to give you the update from where we talked about in May, what we talked about in June. Now, as things sort of giving you an update there and reiterate some of the things I've said before, I've been told and I believe that the Falcons will eventually move on from Deion Jones, and it's just a question of when and or how they do so. And from what I understand, the Falcons have been shopping Deion Jones since last offseason, haven't had any takers, and this is why I've been skeptical throughout this offseason and will continue to be skeptical over the coming days and weeks that any type of trade will develop. It hasn't happened. Don't think it's likely that it will happen in the future, but we'll see if things change. We saw the situation with Baker Mayfield, and it may be a particular trade between the Browns and Panthers because the Browns took on about 2/3 of Baker Mayfield's $15 million base salary, and therefore the Panthers only had to absorb a small part to trade. And it's been speculated to me, and again, this is just speculated, having some conversations with some various folks. So again, we're in speculation territory, but it's been speculated to me that the Falcons may be willing to do something similar in order to facilitate a trade with Deion Jones. You have Deion Jones having currently a $12 million base salary. Any team that trades for him will have to absorb that. So they would have to have more than $13 million in order to facilitate a Deion Jones trade. And more than likely, my suspicion is that you only get like a late round pick, like a 5th, 6th for Deion Jones. We'll see how that plays out. But in this speculative hypothetical scenario, the Falcons may go to a team and say, look, we'll take on half of that base salary, $6 million. You only have to absorb $6 million. And the Falcons can currently afford to do that because according to overthecap.com, they have about $13 million in salary cap space, although that was, the number before the Eddie Goldman contract. So we'll see how that changes after the details of Eddie Goldman's contract comes in. But right now, there's only 13 teams in the NFL, according to overthecap.com, that have $13 million or more in salary cap space, right? That could realistically today trade for Deion. But if the Falcons were willing to take on $6 million of that base salary and say now all of a sudden instead of needing $13 million, you only need $7 million in cap space, there's 27 teams that have $7 million or more in current cap space. So that may be a way that the Falcons can help facilitate a trade, and maybe a team will be much more willing to do a deal at that point if they're only having to acquire Deion Jones for like $6 million and like a 6th or 7th round pick. So we'll see if that happens. The other alternative on when and how the Falcons can move on from Deion Jones is by releasing a player. By releasing him. And the thing that complicates that, and also the trade as well, is the fact that Deion Jones had a shoulder surgery in late May or early June that leaves him out of the offseason. Arthur Smith already announced that he would not participate in the June offseason, but that implies that he'll be ready to go when training camp kicks off later this month when he's forced to pass his physical. And you heard me talk about this in June. That kind of is reminiscent of the situation with the 49ers and D Ford, where the 49ers have publicly stated that once D Ford, who's currently injured, passes a physical, they will release him due to, some league rules about like not being able to cut or trade injured players. And I could imagine the Falcons maybe doing the same thing later this month or at some point in August, should it come to that. And releasing Deion Jones is not going to do much in terms of the salary cap situation in favor of the Falcons salary cap situation. They will create about $1 million in cap space this year, and they would have to eat about $19 million in dead money this year, which is a large amount of money. But given that the Falcons are already eating about a record $63 million in dead money, what's $19 million more? You already set the record. Might as well go for the gold and go for the gusto by, let's see if we can get $90 million in dead money at some point this year. So we'll probably get some clarity on Deion Jones' status later this month when veterans report to training camp on after June 26th, and we'll see what happens with that. Now, I'm sure some of you will insist that Deion Jones is going nowhere, and people like myself who cover the team don't know what we're talking about. We're all scruffy looking blowhards that are fake Falcon fans and are idiots and don't know what we're talking about. And I respond to that and say, who are you calling scruffy looking? But, there is a possibility that Deion Jones sticks around. I know back in May, I had Jarvis Davis of ATL Day Ones on the podcast, and I asked him, is Deion Jones going to be on the roster come day one of training camp? And he said no. I didn't think it would be a yes to that question, but, we're 2 weeks away, and it seems like he's headed to be on the roster on training camp. Again, I think the shoulder injury, those things. But, maybe, regardless of that injury, he would have been on the roster anyway in the future on the team this season. That's possible. Again, don't think it's a high probability or possibility. I could be wrong on that. Wouldn't be the first time. Just will be like the third time I've ever been wrong on a thing. That's a joke. But we'll see if Deion Jones is a part of this competition. It just doesn't make a lot of sense for me that he would be a significant part of this competition. Like, where is he competing? Is he competing at that will linebacker spot with Nick Kwiatkoski? And if he competition, is he going to wear the green dot? He was seemingly stripped of those duties last year and didn't really do anything with his on-field performance that made you think that he should re-earn those duties again this year. And then is he competing with Rashawn Evans at the middle linebacker spot? And then, like we heard Dean Pease say last year many times, that one of the reasons why he moved Deion Jones is because he didn't think he was as physical, as good a as he required at that Mike linebacker spot. And again, his play in 2021 was unlikely to change the opinion of that. So then you couple that with, if the mix, is he taking reps away from Troy Andersen or Mykal Walker this summer? So that's part of the reason why I'm skeptical that the Falcons will be retaining Deion Jones, but who knows? Again, at this point, the Falcons don't tell us anything. Arthur Smith is infamous, depending on who you talk to, or famous. Fans and media is like mushrooms, right? Keep them in the dark and feed them stuff. So last point I'll say about Deion Jones, I'm not, I don't consider myself a Deion Jones hater or whatever. I probably among his biggest critics within the fan base from 2017 to 2020. But most of that stemmed from the fact that I just thought he was kind of overrated by the fan base, that, the fans thought out of 10 player when I thought of him for the most part. There were some moments there, particularly latter half of 2017, noted on a previous episode a couple of weeks ago. He was mostly a 6 out of 10 player during that stretch of games, and I think he's still capable of being that 6 out of 10. It's probably not going to happen in Atlanta. I think the scheme is not really conducive to him playing at that high enough level, and a change in scenery would benefit him, and obviously the Falcons feel like a change in scenery will also benefit them, at least in the long term. May not necessarily do so in the immediate future, but it's notable situations like, again, I was Deion Jones' biggest critic for several years, and now it's like, okay, let's pump the brakes a little bit on the Deion Jones hate, at least as far as I'm concerned. And that's just the nature of fandom, where you hype up a guy for many, many years, and then the player fails to live up to your arbitrary expectations. Fan of a team, and then you blame the player. It's not you that had the unrealistic expectations for that player. It's the player's fault that he didn't live up to your arbitrary expectations. And so if you're that type of fan that finds yourself falling into that time loop and that cycle time and time again, then we of course know Locked On Falcons is the podcast for you, because we never on this podcast, and you will be broken of that habit very shortly. You'll be like, oh, I'm high on this player, and the Falcons, and like, nope, not so fast, my friend. So that, again, another joke. But we'll see sort of what happens with Deion Jones, guys, and we'll see if he is the fifth linebacker on the roster. But we'll talk about some of the guys that could be the fifth linebacker on the roster, and one of those guys, in Nate Landman, the undrafted free agent out of Colorado, could be the next Paul Worrilow or the next Pat Schiller, and I'll tell you why that's a as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, before we get there, speaking of having conversations with Jarvis Davis, you can have a conversation, or at least a one-sided conversation with Jarvis Davis every single day if you check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, where Jarvis Davis is one of two hosts of the ATL Day Ones. But ATL Day Ones is one of three shows on that Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed. You can check out A to Z with Mark Zeno. You can check out Hitting Hard with John Chuckery. And all three shows are breaking down local Atlanta and Georgia sports, as well as national headlines. And you can find them all on your preferred podcast platform, all the same podcast platforms that you're currently listening to and or watching Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So guys, before we wrap up today's linebacker conversation, I do want to let you guys know that, we will be, the plan is, again, all best plans come to fruition, but the plan is that we'll wrap up the defense for the rest of the week, talking corners, talking safeties for the rest of the week. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on your preferred podcast platform in order to get that content. But let's talk about the last the back end competition at the linebacker position, and the fact that the Falcons may be keeping 5 linebackers this year. Again, various roster projections, think that player might be Deion Jones. I don't be Deion Jones, but whoever is that fifth linebacker is going to have trouble finding playing time on Sundays, because typically the Falcons, when they do on occasion, which they did occasionally last year, carry 5 inside linebackers on the team, that fifth guy is most often inactive on Sundays unless there are various injuries that force him have to play on special teams, which we saw Dorian Etheridge, who was the undrafted free agent, one of 2 undrafted free agents alongside the great Felipe Franks, to make the roster, the initial 53-man roster last year. But Dorian Etheridge did play 7 games exclusively on special teams last year, so that fifth linebacker is primarily a special teams player, and we may see him stick again. We may see him get pushed by Rashawn Smith, who spent the last 4 weeks of the season on the Falcons practice squad, or we may see him pushed by Nate Landman, one of the more intriguing undrafted free agents from this post 2022 draft class. And there's always one linebacker that seems to sort of come out of nowhere and make the roster. Last summer, that was Dorian Etheridge, and that's where the Paul Worrilow, Pat Schiller reference from earlier comes from. Like, if you guys, Schiller, he was an undrafted free agent signed with the Falcons back in 2012 out of Northern Illinois, had a good preseason, made the practice squad that season, is probably most fondly remembered by Falcon fans for, rocking the sunglasses and being completely quiet, never saying a word, D-block segments that they used to put out there. And then, Schiller had that great summer in 2012, but then that summer was completely blown out the water the next summer by none other than Paul Worrilow, when he was an undrafted out of Delaware. And while we all know it didn't necessarily work out long-term for Paul Worrilow here in Atlanta, I will still continue to say, going back 20 years of watching, going all the way back to when Javon Curse was wrecking us back in whatever that was, 1999. But Paul Worrillow's preseason in 2013 was as good as probably anybody's, at least in the Falcons uniform. Go up there in the Javon Curse pantheon. But I thought Worrilow played outstanding that summer, and you could probably put him on the Mount Rushmore of these undrafted free agents that come out of relatively nowhere and surprise us in the summer and play really well. Schiller's on that. Etheridge could be on that list. Jermaine Grace potentially could be on that Mount Rushmore as well. And we'll sort of see if Etheridge can sort of pick up where he left off, or Nate Landman sort of the new head on the mountain. Etheridge was a guy that flashed his speed and athleticism, but I didn't love his instincts in that role. And Landman's kind of the opposite player, a guy that's known for his instincts, known for his toughness, known for his old school mentality. His dad was a professional rugby player in South Africa, and so he's seemingly bringing that mentality to the game. Not necessarily a great athlete, although probably a better athlete than relative athletic score or some other places may seem to indicate, because he ran a 4.8640, which is really slow for a linebacker, but he pulled a hammy when he ran that, and he had a really good 10-yard split. He tested as 60th percentile or better in several other drills, like his jumps and his 3-cone as well. So he's a athlete in that regard, and we'll see if he can sort of land one of these back in roster spots, or he'll land on the practice squad. And the reason it's just for future development. Again, this defense is still building, and we're just building long term, adding pieces there. And while a special teams guy, a practice squad guy isn't a huge deal, but it certainly could be valuable depth, because again, going back, Evans, Nick Kwikkowski may be 1-year rentals for the Falcons this year. Maybe one of those two guys, will earn a multi-year contract with the Falcons, but it's very likely that at least one of those guys, if not both, will move greener pastures next offseason, because of the presences of guys like Troy Andersen and potentially Mykal his contract year. And so in some hypothetical, speculative scenario where you have Troy Andersen, you have Mykal Walker next year, you have whichever of the two guys that's deserving of that contract here in the Falcons, whether it's Kwikkowski, whether it's Evans, or 3 out of the 4 linebackers. It would be lovely to have whoever is a practice squad guy, whoever is this 5th linebacker, whether that's Landman or somebody else, to sort of be to sort of just immediately inherit the void left by whichever is the departing player. And particularly when you imagine a combination of Landman and Troy Andersen at that middle linebacker spot, they seem to have similar sort of high character, intangible type in terms of their reputation. And Landman's probably a little bit more of that downhill in the same mold as Rashawn Evans, while Anderson's strength is obviously more of a coverage guy, and they sort of complement each other in that. Not to sit here and say that Nate Landman is Rashawn Evans or nearly as good as him, but maybe he could be a poor man's Rashawn Evans. So theoretically, he can come in, be a valuable depth piece, give you some special teams value, and then potentially be developed down the road. And that would be nice to have. And so, maybe Landman can add his face to that Mount Rushmore and be the next that impresses in camp and sticks on the roster. And essentially all the Falcons, this regime has to do a better job than previous regimes, because the previous regime, fell in love with Paul Worrilow's preseason performance and were like, we're building our defense around that guy. And that was a mistake. And then that was the Mike Smith regime. And then the Dan Quinn regime had Jermaine Grace, and they were like, yeah, this guy's great, but we're never going to keep him on the roster. And so that's another extreme. So you just got to, with Nate Landman, you just got to find that happy medium in between. Don't build your entire defense around him. Don't just kick him to the curb like Jermaine Grace. Find that happy medium, keep him on the team, but more as a depth guy. So we'll see if the Falcons can do that in the future. And guys, that's going to wrap up our conversation about the linebacker position. As I pointed out earlier, we will be talking about corners and safeties to wrap up this week. And hopefully we can wrap up the special teams group on Sunday evening on YouTube and on the podcast just in time for those rookies to report, I believe, on Tuesday of next week to start training camp. So we're only a couple of days going to put the full court press on and blitz here, much like Dean Pease, with this defensive positional break. If you have any feedback that you want to provide to me on anything we discussed on today's episode, anything we discussed on future or past episodes, by all means, hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here at the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And again, thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Definitely want to check out the Locked On NFL Top 50 next week. But in the meantime, check out Locked On NFL to get the lowdown on all the latest surrounding the other 31 NFL teams, including Mayfield as sort of the facilitator of this future Deion Jones trade. He just spoke with the media, so I'm sure the guys at Locked On NFL as well as Locked On Panthers are covering it. So go check those things out, guys. Really appreciate you joining me once again here on Locked On Falcons. Until then.